Your psyche is responsible for how you perceive the world, and it therefore has a tremendous influence on how you create and describe the worlds in your fictional stories. So today, let's look at which psyches tend to utilize which approach. We'll talk about the two Jungian cognitive functions of extraverted sensing and extraverted intuition, and compare how writers using these functions go about their scene descriptions and world building. I have two example texts here from writers I've had the pleasure to interview, and I'm going to read them in my terrible voice. First of all, let's talk about how the different types of perception in fiction writers leads to the different ways they perceive a scene and write a scene. For this video, we need to have another look at extraverted sensing and extraverted intuition. So let's start with extraverted sensing. As SE users, you consider things as tangible objects, complete with size, mass, temperature, volume, etc. To you, the interesting thing about a person or an object is what they are, not what they could be, especially physical capabilities and skill, but also whether they're sick, injured, or even their emotional state, like whether they're angry, sad, and worried, because all of that is the physical condition. This includes objects and places, whether a place or object is damaged, for instance. Therefore, if you are an extraverted sensing user, you tend to have a need to build things or paint a scene. You focus on all sorts of details because all those details make characters or objects or places more tangible and real, which is how you generally perceive things, as a physical unit complete with physical attributes. And you have a need to make these things in your story just as physically real.
I think the appeal of it really is taking a really stupid idea like that and trying to make it feel real, trying to pile so much detail of sights and sounds and smells into it that it sort of convinces you that it's a real place.
That's what it is all about, making the things as real as possible. You often have an urge to paint a scene first before you start writing any action. You also might complain if you don't get sufficient descriptions of people, objects, and places in a book that you are reading. You focus on the condition of clothes, skin, and of course, body language. Extroverted sensing users focus a lot on the body language of characters and who's paying attention to what. But we'll talk about that when we finally talk about characters in the next season. To illustrate this point, I want to share the first excerpt of a story here from a writer I've interviewed, a strategist writer. This is his first work in progress, and this man has, by his own account, never tried anything in terms of writing before, and he chose to start out trying to write a novel for his children. A shadow fell over him. He blinked up through a film of salt and pain. A dark silhouette was looming over him. It felt more shape than man. Broad shoulders capped a wiry frame, muscles coiled tight from years of hard labor. Nick blinked against the sun, his vision sharpening to make out the figure's darkened skin, deep as bronze, mixed with salt and grime that clung like rust to iron, crusted in the crevasses of neck and shoulders, a badge of pride earned by long days spent working under an open sky. As you can see, this is not just descriptions that paint the picture, but he also keeps weaving in a physical history to this character that he's introducing here. The author's extraverted sensing does everything in its power to make this character tangible and real. I want to add here that I have seen some SE users reduce the amount of descriptions deliberately because they aim for a tighter prose and performance, and they don't want to bore the reader. So that also happens, that they actually go the other direction and give too little descriptions. So now let's move on to extraverted intuition. As NE users, you just don't have that focus, because strong NE comes with weak SE. As NE users, you don't look at body language so much, and you might even forget to connect characters to the physical realm. For instance, by having someone lean against a door frame, or smoke a cigarette, or wrinkle their nose from the stench. If you're an NE user, your writing will contain less descriptions of body language, and you will focus less on what your characters pay attention to, because you also don't focus on that with the people in your life. However, as an NE user, you have your own superpowers. NE users don't see a character, object, or place as a physical being, but rather a unit of potential. NE considers the possibility of things. It looks like a cup of water, but it could be a cup of poison. He looks like a police officer, but he could turn out to be a criminal. In other words, as an extroverted intuition user, you want to do stuff with stuff. You want to place things in your story and explore what these things could be and what could happen as a result of these things being in your story. You want to explore potential. The focus isn't so much on crafting the experience, but on enjoying it, on receiving a rewarding enjoyment, which is why NE users tend to try and manifest their imagination quickly. They don't want to be held back by having to craft the world and write all those pesky descriptions. They see it all in their minds, in their imagination, which oftentimes lead to them neglecting to add them into the story. We can see this at the example of the second piece I want to share, from an explorer writer with very weak extroverted sensing. The author said she had written many pieces before, but this is the first that she had finished. Danny works at the Lighthouse Diner, a small diner off a nearly forgotten highway in the middle of nowhere. Danny is sitting at a table with her best friend and co-worker Cindy, watching TV while they mindlessly fold napkins around silverware. A How to Survive show is playing on the TV, mounted in the corner in front of them. This episode in particular is showcasing shark attacks, with a survival expert going through all the different tactics you can utilize to survive. Cindy turns to look at Danny and asks, "Do you really think you can get away from a shark by poking out its eyes?" Danny stops and thinks for a moment. I feel like it would only make the shark angry and chomp on you harder," Cindy quickly adds before Danny can reply. In this piece, we clearly see that the author was eager to get into the scene and get these characters to talk and have fun with each other. The author doesn't need to paint the scene in order to live in it. At this point, I want to thank the writers for giving me the permission to perform their texts on YouTube. So now that we know these behaviors about extroverted sensing and extroverted intuition, we can move on to discussing how these cognitive functions impact how writers go about world building. But before we do that, please like and subscribe. Alright, so let's start once again with extroverted sensing. Since extroverted sensing users have this tendency to consider the physicality of things, they tend to place their stories in real places or historical periods. That way, you don't need to imagine a new world, which you will find a hard time doing anyway due to the lack of extroverted intuition. Prominent examples are Harry Potter, Artemis Fowl, Percy Jackson, as well as series like Jack Reacher or James Bond. And if you do want to invent a new world, you'll likely give it your best to make it as real and tangible as possible, which is what we see in movies like Star Wars or Avatar by James Cameron. Most historical fiction, mystery thrillers, crime fiction or horror, and especially games and movies are made by extroverted sensing users. That's not a rule, it's just a tendency. However, in their pursuit to make the local image so very physical, extroverted sensing users sometimes neglect the wider world, sometimes to the point that they forget to let the audience know what universe we're in, what age, what country we're in, and so on. I've seen this a few times, this amazing prose and all those sensory details about the characters' environments and immediate surroundings, and in chapter 5 I still have no idea about the frame of the story, where on the world map it played, when it played, what was happening outside of the story location, and so on. Of course, leaving information out like this might be an artistic choice, but the point is that oftentimes with extroverted sensing users, it isn't a choice, but neglect. Extroverted sensing users who start out writing tend to get the feedback that audiences want to know more about the wider world and the age and the universe that the story plays in. You need to understand that letting the reader know about the wider world, even if they never get to see it, adds to the realism and immersion of your world.
When I started writing the draft, and then afterwards I sent it to my editor and she was like, "Oh, this needs more world building." Plotting out the character dynamic was my chief concern at the start, but then as more and more of the story took shape, that was when I realized that in order for the love story to be realistic, it needed to be set in a fully realized world.
Let's keep going with extroverted intuition. Extroverted intuition users do envision the world beyond the visible, beyond what the characters can see. If you are an extroverted intuition user, then you are a naturally born world builder. You are able to abstract reality and imagine all sorts of scenarios that differ from reality. As an NE user, you like to explore those possibilities. Adrian Tchaikovsky wrote a story where he explores the idea of a species that doesn't rely on natural selection. Or you might just choose to write your very own world with its very own history and magic system, like in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, or in R.K.D. Martin's A Memory Called Empire, or in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, in Christopher Paolini's Inheritance series, or in Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. Another very important aspect, you sometimes just add things without asking whether it makes sense to add them. You tend to just place things into your world without considering the how, because you care much more about what you could do with these things as the author. Let's just throw some giant ice wall into the map to keep the White Walkers out, and then we'll discover how it got there. I'm not saying that's how it happened, but that's something an NE user would be doing. Let's just say it got there by magic. Beginner writers who are extroverted intuition users often get the feedback that they need to describe things more and establish how they got there and how they fit into the world. Alright, this was the last video for the perception functions. You should know with a high degree of confidence by now which cognitive functions you use predominantly in the perception realm. Either introverted sensing, extroverted intuition, or extroverted sensing, introverted intuition. In the next video, we're finally going to start talking about judgment functions and all the different aspects of fiction writing that they influence. And from there onward, we gradually will combine the perception functions and judgment functions into the quadras. And then I finally get to explain to you guys why I named the 4 quadras: the strategists, the explorers, the navigators, and the cartographers. And I hope I'll see you in those videos.